Well, thank you very much, Vegan. And thank you for inviting me to Princeton. It's a pleasure to be here on such a nice day. I suspect I'm probably missing out on Boston weather like this too. Anyway, I'm going to give a few minutes on social capital and population health, and describe some of my ongoing and recent research. So here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I don't think any talk about social capital can proceed without some words about definition, which is very contentious. And then I'm going to give an example of some recent work on causal inference, using the example of whether social participation can enhance health. And then I'll speak at the end, toward the end, on my most recent area of interest of applying social capital, which is how it is relevant for disaster resilience and recovery. This is about my field work in the Tohoku area of Japan after the tsunami and earthquake. All right, so here's the first part about definition. It's very contentious. I know that people have weighed in on this many times, but one common definition that I use, which is common to people like Bourdieu and Coleman, who both opined about this, is that social capital can be rather straightforwardly described as resources derived from membership in social networks. And from my perspective, it can be analyzed as an attribute of individuals as well as a characteristic of the group. There are certain resources that members of groups can be privy to that is a group characteristic as well as an individual one, and we sometimes call this social cohesion. Now, having said that, some eminent people, have opined that social capital is not really a form of capital, and the eminent Kenneth Arrow is one such person. He said capital should have two characteristics. Number one, that its creation entails some sort of sacrifice of present consumption for future benefit, and secondly, that it enhances the productivity of other factors of production. I think social capital, most of us would agree that it satisfies part B, because the resources derived from social relations can be fungibly used to enhance productivity of other kinds of capital, like human capital or physical capital. But I guess the bit that he became stuck on is that it's not really capital, because none of us, when we invest in when we hang out and derive benefits from social relations, that we do so purposively by sacrificing present consumption for future benefit. So Arrow says don't use the word capital. I mean, I think I happen to disagree a bit. I think certainly when we hang out with friends, we don't do so for the purpose of hoping to invest for some future benefit. But there are other kinds of social participation, like voluntarism, which involves giving up present consumption. I mean, time is a scarce resource. So when we give up our time, when we'd be rather sitting at home watching TV and drinking beer, and we're going volunteering in some community activity, that seems to me a form of sacrifice of present consumption for future benefit. But I just wanted to point out that the use of the word, contentious use of the word capital. The other part of the objection is that social capital is not social. So if it's not done social or it's not capital, then it begins to sound like the Holy Roman Empire, which if you recall, Voltaire said it was not holy, it's not Roman, and it's not really an empire. So this argument, which I've heard from economists, is that you can have resources exchanged in networks, but often those benefits are actually limited to members of the social network, and they're not really social in a wider sense. I push back against that argument as well. I think there are some aspects of social capital that really are social and have externalities that extend beyond members of that immediate network. So just to quickly go through why social capital is, I think, is relevant for health as well as other outcomes. Well, it's well known that when we're connected to intimate social networks, we can derive resources such as information, exchange of instrumental assistance of one kind or another, and social reinforcement. So far, so good. And the argument is that some of this may not be social because it's captured just within the membership of the network. However, we now know that when we extend the idea to weaker and more extensive networks, there are some emergent properties such as the contagion of behaviors and norms, the ability of the group to exercise informal control, and the ability of the group to undertake collective action. And these things, I argue, have these kind of spillover characteristics. If we take the example of social contagion, in public health at least, we say that depending on the social structure to which you belong, you may be influenced by people in the wider social network that you may not even be familiar with. I'm referring to the studies by Christakis and others who show that health behaviors like smoking and drinking and drug abuse tend to have this characteristic of being spread like a contagion across networks. So in this picture I've shown here, an individual who's at the periphery of the network is a smoker, and the idea of the network literature is that you may be influenced up to 3 degrees of separation away by the behavior of others in the group. And so in this example, that woman on the corner is not actually connected in any way to this individual here except through 2 additional ties, but she may be influenced by that person. At least that's the claim made in the public health medical literature, such as Christakis' famous New England Journal article about the collective dynamics of the spread of smoking cessation across a social network. And if I'm sure you probably already know the study, but this is a long-term follow-up study of the Framingham heart study cohort, where they happen to be able to map the social network structure of all the people who were participants. I think they did so through a convenience mechanism, namely every time the participants came back for a periodic interview and physical examination, they were asked, just in case we lose touch with you, can you nominate 5 others that we could reach out to? And because Framingham in Massachusetts is a rather close-knit community, it turned out that a large number of people who people nominated were also participants in the study, and hence they were able to map the social networks of the study, and then able to study the spread of diffusion of behaviors and norms. And in this example from the New England Journal, they showed, this is one large component of the Framingham study, showing the connectedness of people, and also by color coding, the yellow circles means that they were smokers in 1971. And so you can see, just by squinting at it, in 1971, the majority of people were smokers. So it's not like the whole network diagrams drenched in nicotine juice or something, it's yellowish. And then 30 years later, you can see this predominantly turn green. People are giving up in droves, and not only is it turning green, but I think if you squint, you can see that the yellow remaining smokers are getting pushed out more and more out toward the periphery. They lose their central position in networks, and they claim, at least the claims that Christakis and others made, is that smoking cessation, along with other behaviors, is apparently contagious. It appears to ripple out to 3 degrees of separation. And the important thing about the 3 degrees of separation is that we may not even know the people who are influencing us. If these claims are correct, then it may be that somewhere in the network, 3 degrees away, someone stops smoking, and eventually it's going to reach over to you. Because we all know our immediate friends by definition, and probably a good many of us know our friends' friends, but I'm guessing that very far fewer of us know our friends' friends' friends. But the claim that these authors made was that if they stop smoking, then eventually there's a discernible influence that reaches over to where you are. So I think in that sense, The smoking cessation would be a health benefit. That benefit would be something that is almost like a spillover effect of being part of that wider network. It's not just confined to people who you're intimate with. Now, I add the caveat that behavioral contagion, as I've described, is not necessarily healthy, because the same study has shown that just as smoking cessation can spread through networks, so can the spread of obesity, and just as happiness can spread through social contact, so can depression. So it cuts both ways. Social connectedness is agnostic with respect to what is actually being diffused, and some people refer to this as the dark side of social capital. And of course, although I talked about someone else's study as if we're talking about causality, it is disputed whether this represents, just homophily and selection into friendship networks, or is actually causal or not. So that's this is where I'm going to talk about some of our recent work on trying to dig a little bit deeper into causality. Now, before I do that, in public health and in population health, the way we measure social capital is through assessment of social cohesion. Actually, we ask people in surveys, what's your perceived ability of the group that you belong to undertake collective action, what we call collective efficacy. Do you think your neighbors, will be able to gather together to undertake some collective action, and it's on some sort of Likert type of scale of response? Informal control is the ability of people in the collective, let's say a neighborhood or a workplace, to exercise informal control over deviant behavior. Both of these concepts arose out of the Chicago study of Rob Sampson, Roland Bush, and Tony Earls. Trust we view as being an important moral resource which lubricates reciprocity exchanges. So we tend to ask people about whether you think others in the collective are trustworthy. And as a kind of behavioral measure of social cohesion, we ask about social participation. How often do you socialize with others or participate in different kinds of groups? So that's how we have tended to operationalize this idea. Now, the causality, I'm going to talk about causality of social participation as an example. There's a lot of debate about whether social participation actually enhances health, because if we pause to think about it, there are lots of threats to causal inference just because we observe that people who participate in groups seem to be healthier. Now, how do we know that one caused the other? And I'm going to point to some studies that we've been doing with Japanese colleagues. Kanamori and colleagues evaluated this question in an ongoing cohort study where we asked, what about these community-based sports organizations that people participate in, particularly the elderly, and is participation in sports beneficial for health? This is a sort of epidemiologic paradigm where you have a fairly large cohort study of about 13,000 individuals, all of them aged over 65, who are free of functional disability at baseline, and we follow them up for 4 years to see whether participation at baseline predicts their onset of incident functional disability based upon medical examination. There's a sort of set of criteria that define whether someone's disabled or not. So in this follow-up of 13,000 subjects, about 1,000 of them died, and another 1,500 developed incident disability. I mean, I'm just going to show you what it looks like when we look at social participation in health. Now, the trick here, think of it, this is a Japanese study, and throughout Japan, the elderly who looking for things to fill their time, tend to participate in lots of activities such as croquet, they call them gate ball, petanque, walking groups, golf, and so forth. And from a social scientist perspective, what I want to know is what is it that's healthy about participation? Is it the exercise, or is it the social participation? That's one way to frame that question. So what we did was we broke up every individual in the study into one of 4 types of people. There's some people who are, so we asked them, do you participate in an organization, yes or no? And are you personally physically active or not? Namely, you did reported doing more than half an hour of some kind of physical activity each month. If you said you did less than 30 minutes per month, you categorize them as being sedentary, and if you did more than that, you're physically active. Now, the interesting thing is that you may belong to a sports group, but some people are sedentary. And so they say they belong to gateball communities and petanque clubs, but they don't actually exercise. Presumably, they're just spectators, or that they are acting as the club treasurer or some official role like this. So this provides us a very interesting group of people. I mean, so if you just look at this, we would think that, of course, you want to be physically active, so we expect these top two groups to be the healthiest. You're participating in a club and you're physically active. Some people don't participate in any organization, but they're physically active. We call those lone exercisers. They just, go by themselves to the gym or something.
Do you really mean 30 minutes per month?
Yeah, 30 minutes, yeah. That was the way the question was asked.
Over a whole
month, yeah. So if you don't do 30 minutes, you're sedentary. Oh, I mean, Marie, no. That's pretty common. I think in the United States, about 40% of people report zero physical activity in any week and probably the whole month. So they do nothing. That's the public health of physical activity. So anyway, let's look at what these findings show. So this is the hazard ratios of incident disability during 4 years of follow-up, and we're adjusting for sociodemographics, marital status, baseline health conditions. So we're trying to take account of the fact that it isn't that bad health led people to participate. So first of all, relative to people who are active participants, they are physically active and they participate in sports groups of one kind or another. If you're sedentary, that is, you don't belong to a group and you don't exercise, you're significantly more likely to develop incident disability. So far, so good. But the next interesting bit is that if you exercise by yourself without participating, that's not particularly healthy in this case. In this example, exercise by itself is not sufficient. You're about 30% more likely to become disabled even if you exercise by yourself but do not participate in a social group. If you participate in a group but you are sedentary, you have the same risk as someone who's an active participant. So this in this example at least, is the social participation. Participation trumps exercise. When you think that people are getting exercise by belonging to a group, it's actually the social participation. That's what I want to argue. So that's a health benefit of social capital. Now, of course, I just told an inexcusable causal story. We don't really know whether it's one causes the other, and so the question, we ideally like to do a randomized trial, but those are very expensive and time consuming. But the problem, as you all know, is we really need to get down to whether social participation actually causes health. When we know that the reverse is possible, you have to be healthy to get out of the house and participate, and even with rather careful adjustment for baseline differences in health, you never know. There's a residual skepticism whether you captured everything about that person and their ability to get out and participate. And of course, there's an unobserved heterogeneity in there's a long list of potential confounding variables, personality characteristics, genetic, whatever, that are common prior causes of the exposure and outcome. And if we don't adjust for those things, then we have residual confounding. That's the way that epidemiologists think about this problem. So can we do something else? Midway between actually running an experiment and analyzing observational data. So here we've learned from the economists to start looking for natural experiments, and the direction that we're going is trying to think about instruments for social participation. Instruments. So as you know, the idea of instruments, you try to find some variable that causes the exposure of interest to vary exogenously without directly affecting the health outcome. So the task is to look for those kinds of natural experiments in nature. And so the second study I want to introduce you from our group, published last year by Dr. Ichiro, who's a keen fisherman, as you can see. He's an economist, by the way. So we found an opportunity for a natural experiment, which was that we happened to be doing a national cohort study of the elderly and what predicts incident disability. And just by pure chance, in one of the field sites, the local municipality decided to open a whole series of community-based centers that were designed to encourage participation among the elderly. So that's a natural experiment, and that's our instrument. So the study I'm describing is based in Nagoya, which is a third largest city in Japan, population of 2.3 million, and south of Nagoya is the Chita Peninsula, which our field site, one of our field sites, is in the town of Taketoyo, very small town of 42,000 people. In the midst of our study, the officials in this town launched a campaign to promote healthy aging. And the way that that filtered into actual practice was that they decided to open a whole lot of community centers where seniors could congregate and socialize with each other. The Japanese, for some unknown reason, call them salons. Sounds like a literary salon. Anyway, as I mentioned, some of these town residents also just happen to be participants of a cohort study that is led by Professor Kondo, but I happen to be involved in. And so, these community centers, they probably look rather like ones here. The elderly congregate, and volunteers engage them in activities such as learning to compose haiku poems, or playing bingo, which are very popular programs for people in the neighborhood to get together. So we want to know, does participation in these kinds of programs promote health? If you do the naive analysis, it looks like it does. So if you look, you remember we have prospective data, and in between 2006 and 2008, a whole bunch of these salons opened up, and so we can see whether by joining these salons, people ended up reporting better health at follow-up. And so in both groups, the non-participants and the participants, it looks like self-rated health. That's the one item of whether your health is excellent or good compared to fair or poor. In both groups, they sort of went up for whatever reason. But then you can see that in the participants, it seemed to go up a little bit more. That's the naive regression result, or not regression, it's a naive difference in difference result. But we don't know whether this is causal, because there's likely to have been selection into participation or non-participation. Those factors we could try to control for, but the true skeptic will say, I have a list of a half dozen other things you failed to take account of. That's the skeptical argument that we're left with. So the instrument that we thought of was distance of the newly opened salons from people's home residences. So the idea is that the town opened a bunch of salons at random, wherever they could find an underutilized daycare center or something, they converted it into a salon. And I'm arguing that if you happen to have been living in a residence where the town opened a salon nearby, then by the fact of it being close to where you live, you're more likely to participate. I'm arguing that this is like a coin toss, which assigns people to participation or not. And then I'm also further arguing that there is no direct relation between what distance you happen to have been living from a salon and your evaluation of your own health or trust of other people. If this fails, then the instrument fails. But that's the argument that we're making. So here's what it looks like. This is just a diagram, a map showing up to 2008. 3 salons that opened in the squares, and the circles represent the residents in the ongoing study that we happen to have. And the first check of the instrument is its relevance. Does does distance to the salon actually correlate with your probability of actually participating in the salon activities? And there's a nice relationship here. F statistics something like 70 or something. So the closer you are, the more likely you are to participate. And there's a distance decay. If the salon opened up more than 2 kilometers from where you lived, well, you're not going to go there to participate. So I'm sure I don't need to go through this in any detail. The idea is to do it in 2 steps. You first instrument salon participation here, where the equation has as a predictor the value of the instrument. In this case, the inverse of the distance between your address and the nearest salon. And then once you've instrumented the salon participation, it's plugged into the prediction equation for health. In this case, Z scores for self-rated health. And so we're studying the amount of change in the health as a result of the difference in participation induced by the salon, by the distance from the salon. That's the idea. So here's the results. The stage 1 results is when the dependent variable is probability of salon participation, and we show that even controlling for baseline self-rated health, which we can plug into the equation as one of the predictors, since we happen to have observed already, we control it. We find that inverse of distance is strongly related to salon participation. The closer you are, the more likely you are to take part. So that's showing that the instrument, might work. Baseline health, not surprisingly, also related to salon participation. That's why we instrument, because that's that selection. And so in the second stage, the equation is for self-rated health, showing that once again, controlling for baseline self-rated health, which is also strongly correlated with subsequent health. That's not surprising. This is what we expect. Even controlling for these other covariates, the instrumented salon participation remains strongly correlated with health. The more you participate, the better is your Z score for reporting excellent to good health. So this is sort of one attempt where we're trying to get a half step closer to causality without having to go to all the way of doing a cluster randomized trial. And I think it's one direction of research. Now, some of you may be wondering, based on what I just showed of bingo and haiku composition, why would such an innocuous intervention have an impact on the health of the elderly? I mean, if it was so simple, then you could just open some bingo halls, parlors, and get that effect. Now, I think I have a suggestion. I have a sort of hypothesis. I think this is a unique cultural issue in Japan. There's something, and this is my reasoning, which is that in Japan, Japanese culture and Japanese society is very different from what we see in the U.S., where it's very important to provide seemingly innocuous activities like salons in order to allow the elderly to maintain social participation and functioning. And I think a clue comes from the cultural differences in marriage, the meaning of marriage between the West and in Japan. This is a bit of a diversion, but I want to point to a meta-analysis of marital status and mortality in the elderly that was published in Social Science and Medicine a few years ago. These authors, summarized 53 studies throughout the world involving over 250,000 elderly subjects. And once you summarize the literature, they found that, sure enough, there's a robust association between the pooled relative risk of mortality comparing the married to the unmarried, which includes everybody from widowed, divorced, to never married, of about 0.89. There's no surprise to social scientists, because this is one of the most robust associations seen in the field of marriage studies. Interestingly, in this study, there's no gender difference. It's commonly supposed that men benefit more than women from marriage, but if you look at the elderly and across the literature, there's no gender difference. Now, so here's what the analysis looked like. This is the forest and tree plot for the males that were summarized in the study. And you can see that the point estimates, by and large, line up to the left-hand side of the null value, suggesting that married men live longer than unmarried men. and the pooled estimate is 0.88 with 95% confidence intervals from 0.84 to 0.93. That's the men. When we look at the women, once again they tend to line up to the left-hand side, and the pooled estimate is 0.90. So the difference between 0.88 and 0.90 is not significant. That's the basis for concluding that men and women seem to benefit to the same extent from being married. Now, the one thing that really struck me when I was reading this meta-analysis is that there's one study where the point estimate is nearly significant in the opposite direction. In other words, marriage seems to be killing women in the study, and I was very struck. By the author's last name, Nagata, which sounds Japanese. So I looked it up, and sure enough, it is a study from Japan. Japan sticks out in the opposite direction. In this study, which is a 7-year follow-up of 2,000 men and 1,400 elderly women in the city of Gifu, among men, widowhood was not significantly associated with mortality, namely marriage was not protective for the men, and the women went in the opposite direction. So widowhood was significantly protective for mortality in women. Widow women live longer in Japan, and the longer they were widowed, the better their health became. So this to me. There's something, so the story I'm trying to construct is actually there's some other studies too. In the ages cohort that I'm working on with Professor Kondo, older married women report higher prevalence of bad health compared to never married and the widowed. So Japanese women definitely seem to be getting the short end of the stick by being married. Now, I think there's a reason for that, actually, and I think it's based in the confluence of culture and epidemiology. So in the US, we tend to think of retired elderly couples as looking forward to some shared activities after retirement. There's something like these AARP type images of imagining, projecting what would happen after you become retired. In Japan, it's different. It's very different. I've never heard my colleagues talk about retirement in this way. It's quite the opposite. After retirement, after 60% of married women experience what's known as husband-at-home stress syndrome. This Shujin Zaitaku stress shokogun. That's what that says. And this picture, by the way, is an actual picture of these guys who had nowhere to go. They're chased out of their house. They're total strangers, so they spend the whole day sitting on these benches in Shinjuku Park. So why does this happen? It's because if you've ever spent time in Japan or East Asian cultures, you know that the male of the house is the breadwinner. They are overly committed to work. They spend the whole day at work and often a large part of the evening, such that they never see their wives or children. They're up before they are up. They come home long after they've gone to bed. So they do this working pattern for 30 years, and then when they retire, the worlds collide. Because all of a sudden the husband's at home. The wife doesn't know what to do with them. The husband doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing. And consequently, that you end up with this kind of phenomenon. And in Japanese culture, there's even an anthropological term for these men who have lost a place to go to. It's called the Nure Ochiba phenomenon, which translates to those dead leaves, autumn leaves that get stuck on the sole of the foot. And they're very hard to get rid of, so the Japanese housewives describe their own husbands as being like these dead leaves that cling to the sole of the foot, and they can't get rid of them, Washimozoku is another term. There's a Me Too tribe. There's the idea that all of us, the wife's been used to a life of 30 years of going out shopping and doing her errands, and all of a sudden there's this guy who wants to tag along with her. The Me Too tribe. Most discriminatory word of all is the oversized trash. That's all they go use. Wives are describing their husbands. I mean, the fact of the matter in Japan is that most marriages break up when the couples retire. The husband retires, and that's when most marriage counseling takes place. And in that context, I think salon programs are incredibly important because they provide a place. The Japanese term is ba. The men have had a place for 30 years, going to work. They knew what they're supposed to be doing, who they were, where they belong. But these salon programs in that context provides a place for people to congregate. And that's one cultural reason why this social capital intervention works in Japan. All right, so that's causal. That's about I think one of the things in social epidemiology that's really of interest to me is being able to integrate cultural understanding with social life and to do it through epidemiology. I think that's one thing we can contribute. I was talking to the postdoctoral fellows at OPR this morning and explaining that in social epidemiology, which is so much about social life, most of the literature is from the West, and it provides an extremely incomplete picture of social life. And when we turn to other cultures, often the relationships are in the opposite direction, and we need to get beneath it to understand why. That's part of the social epidemiology mission. All right, so disaster resilience is the third and last area I would like to point you to. As I mentioned, social cohesion is measured by informal control, collective efficacy, trust, social participation, and in the context of disaster, these things really come to the fore because, for example, informal control is probably the key ingredient in preventing occurrences of looting, for example, that seems to accompany most major disasters. When Hurricane Sandy struck, lots of stores got looted. That was a big problem. Whereas one of the things that everyone in the media commented on was just how little looting there was in Japan. After this major earthquake, when most people ran out of supplies, here they are, sort of lining up for hours, waiting to have their chance to shop at the local convenience store. Collective efficacy is very important for disaster recovery because it provides the ability of communities to organize, to provide immediate disaster relief, as well as cleanup efforts. And what I'm referring to really is this recent area of scholarship, which really is sort of nicely summarized by Dan Aldrich at Purdue University, where he wrote a book about building resilience and the relevance of social capital for post-disaster recovery. And he summarized it as follows: that community-based networks enhance disaster recovery through at least three different mechanisms, because number one, community-based networks provide the informal assurance that victims can call upon for instrumental assistance, when they've lost their houses and jobs and whatnot. Also, community networks also provide voice and raise the cost of exit. Voice is just his term for the ability of communities to band together, to lobby authorities, and to garner resources into the community for post-disaster reconstruction. And if your networks are based in the community, then it clearly raises the cost of exiting from it, so that more social capital rich communities are better able to attract residents back to the community for reconstruction. I think that's the three mechanisms that have been hypothesized. Now, my recent field work is in the aftermath of the 2011 Great Eastern Japan earthquake. As you may recall, it was one of the largest earthquakes recorded in Japan. About 18,000 people perished, and about more than 250,000 people were displaced. Now, the earthquake had its epicenter about 80 kilometers west, 80 kilometers east of Sendai, which is a town about an hour and a half north of Tokyo by bullet train. Fukushima is, here it is. My study is not about the nuclear disaster, it's about the earthquake and tsunami. These are two different issues in Japan. So my field site is in Iwanuma, which is 80 kilometers west of the earthquake epicenter. Now, here's the study setup. Basically, in 2010 and 2011, my colleagues and I established a nationwide cohort study with about 112,000 people to examine social cohesion and people's trajectory of functional mobility. And we did it throughout the country, from the northern Hokkaido all the way to Okinawa, way down south. And just by pure chance, one of the field sites was in the town of Iwanuma. So this was 7 months before the earthquake and tsunami hit. We completed the baseline where we could examine the social cohesion, and whether this was going to be predicting people's ability to remain free of disability and functional limitations. And then 7 months after we completed the survey, the tsunami earthquake came, and part of the town of Iwanuma was inundated, and a whole bunch of houses destroyed. So this is like, I think, the first ever natural experiment. I didn't like to use that word in this context because of the tragedy, but this is an aerial picture. This is sort of Iwanuma looking from north to south, and this is the map of Iwanuma. The blue is the Pacific Ocean, and the blue circles are where our respondents were located at the time of the baseline survey 7 months prior to the earthquake and tsunami, and the red line shows the extent to which the tsunami waves swept inland. So you can see from this diagram that some people were affected, others escaped. Some people's houses were damaged, others were not. And so our idea is to go back into the field to examine what happened to people's recovery based on their social cohesion or social capital of origin. And just by pure chance, the NIH put out a program announcement in which they said we want to encourage applications which study the elderly, how elderly fare in disasters. So the hypothesis of the study we're in the midst of doing is whether residents in communities with high levels of social cohesion will experience slower functional decline after being exposed to tsunami and earthquake. And as we said, we have baseline survey measures of participation, informal socializing, trust, and so forth. And we're going to look at medical examinations to see what is their long-term incidence of disability as well as functional IADL scores. This project was funded by NIA last year, so it's an R01 project. Iwanuma has a population, as I said, of about 40,000. In the disaster, 150 residents lost their lives. It's a 0.3 mortality rate, so we're expecting about 0.3% of our cohort to have perished, all other things equal. And then about 5,500 were evacuated to temporary shelters. And in the baseline survey that we completed in 2010, all of them were aged over 65. We had a response rate. Actually, we took a census of all Iwanuma residents who were over 65. And from that census, we got a 59% response rate, which is sort of about average for a community-based survey, of every resident in town. Then our follow-up survey, which we're just about to finish. We're a little bit behind schedule, but we started in October. We wanted to interview everybody before the anniversary of the March 11th disaster. So we're trying to squeeze in the follow-up survey before that. And we've been helped by this because in Japan, every resident is registered in a domiciliary registration system called the Koseki system, where every time you move house, you have to report that to the authorities, and they keep a pretty good system, so we can trace everybody. And I think out of the original 5,000 respondents, there's just one resident that is unaccounted for. We know where everyone else is living. So that's the beauty of the Japanese registration system. Now, why do we think that cohesion's got anything to do with functional disability in Japan? And here we had some clues from qualitative studies. Koyama Shihoko was a graduate student in Tohoku University, where we are collaborating. And independent of the Iwanuma study sample, we approached a small group of residents for qualitative studies to find out, how do they get relocated after the disaster, and what sort of social support have they been receiving. Now, one of the things that this qualitative study revealed was that it turns out after people, whose homes were destroyed or partially damaged, and they were relocated to temporary shelters, they did so according to two main mechanisms. There's a group of people who in villages that were destroyed who basically said, let's relocate based upon a lottery system. So we'll draw lots, and if your lucky number comes up, you go first, and the rest stay in the school gymnasiums or whatever it is that they were happen to have been temporarily evacuated to. Then there's a group of people who insisted on group resettlement. Basically, the village council came together and said, we're not going to move unless everybody can move as a whole, as a group. And this method tended to preserve existing social ties in the village. So we're going to study how this might, the hypothesis that social capital rich neighborhoods tended to insist on a group resettlement, whereas those that were not cohesive did so by lottery. That's just a working hypothesis. And certainly in this small qualitative study, we do find that compared to those who were relocated as a group, those who just moved into temporary shelters by lottery do report lower prevalence of receiving social support from neighbors as well as providing it. So there's a difference. I think people who moved as a group maintained their neighborly relations, and they kept on supporting each other, or at least meeting them and socializing with them, whereas those who moved in by lottery ended up moving close to people they didn't know. And as I said, I think this for the elderly is critical in maintaining functional independence. So this is what I'm talking about. 10 days after disaster, you saw in newspapers everybody evacuate to the local school gymnasium, and you was like living in a concentration camp. And then 8 months later, they're all settled in these prefabs, and they look like container housing that is the temporary shelter. So it was between this situation and this transition where people either moved randomly and ended up living next to people they didn't know, or they moved as a whole village to maintain neighborly relations. These are my two colleagues from Tohoku University. And you'll notice in the design of these prefabs, they look like refurbished shipping containers. You see that it was late fall when I visited, so there's no one there, but you can see these parasol and benches, which clearly are designed to encourage people to come out and informally socialize. And so I don't have the follow-up data because we're about to clean up the follow-up data and analyze it sometime later this spring. We've looked at the baseline Iwanuma data from before the earthquake, and just to check that everything is behaving as they should. And in this multi-level linear regression, here are the associations between individual level variables and IADL score. This is a continuous score made up of whether you're able to bathe, go to the toilet independently, transfer, walk around the house, whatever. So the higher the score, the better. And we see that, as expected, the older your age, the lower your IADL score. In this study, certainly the never married and the widowed have slightly lower IADL scores relative to the married, and there's an educational gradient, so that the shorter the years of schooling attained, the lower the IADL score. So things seem to be moving in the correlated and expected direction. This is a multi-level study, so this is the level 2 variables. This is from a random intercepts multi-level regression. So in addition to controlling for all of these individual characteristics, if you came from a neighborhood, the neighborhood in this case is a sort of an administrative district that contains about, 500 residents. It's a sort of small area in Japan. If residents in your neighborhood reported low informal socializing, you are significantly more likely to have lower IADL score. If your neighbors don't participate, you're also less likely to have IADL functioning. The only variable where we don't show anything is the low trust of neighbors, and this is the respective variances at different levels. The ICC is about 3.5%, which is in line with what we find in other neighborhood studies of disability and functional limitation. So, I can't report the follow-up results, but what we, hypothesizing is that prior to the earthquake, probably those who came from high cohesion neighborhoods had a higher level of IADL score compared to low social capital residents. And then presumably the tsunami and earthquake led to a big drop in both groups, but that those who are from high cohesion backgrounds have a better ability to maintain functioning over follow-up. The reason being that if you come from high cohesion neighborhoods, then you're more likely to end up in this situation. The volunteers who visit these temporary shelters, tell us that in these villages where the elderly have become separated from their former neighbors, they've lost all reason to go out. So you see, older women who used to spend an hour each day putting on makeup and getting dressed to go out and visit with your neighbors, they've lost that reason. They get stuck in these container houses and they rapidly lose function. So we're putting our bets that social cohesion matters because of the ability to maintain these kinds of ties. And in a country or a society like Japan, it's very important. This informal socializing is a huge factor in preserving function after exposure to a major disaster. This is an example of the kind of social capital that local officials are trying to build. This is obviously the inside of one of these container houses, and every month the Iwanuma city officials convene a meeting with the residents of these places to troubleshoot, to find out what needs are there. And you can see in this room the volunteers are wearing the yellow vests. The guys with the suits and whatnot, these are the town officials, and then you see the residents scattered here and there. And like I say, these meetings are very important because they not only solve problems in the community, but they also involve large bottles of sake, as you can see. There you are. It's literally taking this social cohesion to another level. Now, the last thing, I visited in January, last 2 months ago. So this is now 3 years later. They can't stay in these prefabs forever, so they have to be now finally moved to permanent apartment blocks. And the way that they're doing this is they're leveling these rice fields outside of the town of Iwanuma, and they're going to build these apartment blocks in the middle of nowhere. So I'm very fearful they're going to lose this kind of social informal socializing, and we're in the midst of having just completed the wave 2, but I fear that by the time they come to these third stage of reconstruction and resettlement, they might actually be doing a disservice by sending people out into the middle of nowhere. Anyway, I think this is a story to be continued. If you invite me back next year, I'll tell you the results of the second wave. Anyway, so that was my 2 cents worth, and I promised to leave some time for questions. So thank you very much.